Okay. Me and this hair, I just want y'all to know this is the Detroiter in me. I will not be on camera without my coiffed. Okay, here we go. Three, two, one. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Dreaming Forward podcast. I'm your host, Kalyn Wilson, and I'm so excited because it's January, it's the new year, and so it presents an opportunity for us to show up in people, culture, and inclusion work much better than we did the year before. Of course, I want to start by wishing everyone a happy new year. I hope that your new year is kicking off in an amazing way. I know mine is going very well. I'm very excited. And I hope that you find this information really helpful as you seek to kick off the year within your organizations and in your own careers. Hope you find it very helpful and informative. So, workforce planning is going to be our topic for the month. And I'm going to talk about a couple of different aspects of workforce planning and how you can leverage the process to ease all of the work that you'll do, particularly around recruiting and retention throughout the year. Workforce planning is also known as strategic workforce planning. And so many of you may be unfamiliar with the term itself, but the process is probably going to be a little bit familiar once we start to talk about the steps. For some of you, you may be more familiar with what is considered operational workforce planning. So if you've ever worked in a role where you were responsible for setting schedules, making sure that there was appropriate coverage on shifts or on routes, it's a similar concept, but it's thinking more high level and at a macro level for the organization. So, again, strategic workforce planning is a process, but it touches so many different parts of the employee experience. And so, great organizations focus their time on the strategic side of it because it makes the operational part much easier as the year progresses. There are four steps to workforce planning. And the first is that you are going to analyze your current workforce. The second is that you are going to project or imagine what you would like to see for the future workforce. What does it look like in an ideal sense? Maybe 3 months, 6 months, 12 months down the line. You're going to then assess the gap. So the difference between where you are now and the difference between where you want to be, what's missing. And then finally, you want to implement a plan that you develop in order to fill that gap. Four steps sounds extremely easy. Definitely not as simple as it looks. It involves quite a few stakeholders, and those would include your HR BPs or HR business partners. It also would include your HR leadership. It would include quite a few people managers, and you could engage them in different ways. We'll get to that in a second, as well as executives among teams. And the goal of workforce planning is to have a really good assessment of where the organization is now talent wise. That identification will lead to greater intimacy. It also could give you some insight into emerging leaders who you may have ignored, and it positions you to reduce waste. So if you think about how much money and how much time is spent on recruitment and even on trying to retain people who may be already out the door, workforce planning helps you to reduce some of that time because you'll already be projecting and looking at who's high risk, who is high potential, who is someone that we need to develop, and who is someone that, to be honest, we could probably afford to lose because of performance or lack of culture fit, etc. So now that we got that first part out of the way, just a general overview, let's start with that first step, which is analyzing the current workforce. And there are a ton of tools that you can use to do this analysis. One of my favorites is the 9 box grid, and it assesses current performance by potential performance. So it's an actual grid with the 9 boxes, and you plot employees in the boxes based on their past performance reviews, future career goals, potential, etc. I like the 9 box because it gives you a bit of a range, and it can also be color coded, which I think can be very helpful as well, just in terms of visually representing the spread of talent on a particular team or in a particular department. Another benefit to the 9 box grid is that it does compare current performance to potential. And so rather than just looking at that as a way to say, is this person doing their job and can they do their job? It really gives you an opportunity to open a discussion with employees. Because if you notice that they are a high performer but with low potential, you may wonder, how could that be? What's happening here? Maybe it's that they may need to make a lateral move to a different department or functional area. If you find that they are someone who is both low potential and low performance, it still gives you a chance to have a conversation with them to figure out what may be happening. Of course, you all know that we're still reeling in many ways from the pandemic. And so that person may have had family issues, personal issues. Maybe they were going back to school and didn't feel comfortable sharing it with you. And so they're not able to engage. So, again, for me, I like the 9 box because rather than just being a way to eliminate people, it's a chance to open up conversation because you can see these cross sections between actualized work and potential work, or performance rather, and engage them to find out where is the disconnect or where is the opportunity, and see if there is a better fit for them to put them on track to be maximized even more. So, the other part to this particular side of analyzing the workforce is thinking about the spread of talent across the organization. I know many organizations have experienced layoffs or reductions in force. Quite a few companies have merged or you've acquired other companies, and even more companies have reorganized. And so all of those changes have led to a very different spread than you may have seen in 2021, 22, and especially that you could potentially be thinking about for Q1 of 23. That analysis is going to help you to see where can we reposition people rather than think about who do we need to bring in. I mentioned a word earlier, intimacy. And you'll hear me say that word a lot on this podcast because I think it's so important in people, culture, and inclusion work. But the analysis process really should create a deeper intimacy. You should be able to ID skill sets, dreams, hopes, competencies, ideations, wants, desires of the talent that works in your company. People are human and they have things that they wish that they could do. They have things that they may have worked on and accomplished for you that they've never shared. And so you want to give people a chance to share that with you. You want to understand more about who they are because you might have some hidden gems in the organization that you just have not recognized. This is particularly true if you know that you have very different levels of competency among your people managers. So that analysis process can be extremely helpful to course correct for what people managers may not be doing. That may mean that HR has to heavily own this process, perhaps more than other processes, but I think it'll be worth it for you if you get to retain top talent rather than kind of make it a talent meal and just keep going and getting new people and then they end up in the same spot over and over again. Let's move on and talk about step 2, which is imagining and ideating on what the future workforce will need to look like in your company. This one can get tricky because typically companies are thinking about just simply filling gaps from people who have left. But I will really encourage you to think beyond that about how you can potentially repurpose talent. There are a couple of buzzwords that have been floating around in the HR space, and they are upskill and reskill. Reskilling people can be so beneficial, and this is where you can leverage things like on the job training, apprenticeships, shadowing, and mentorship to be able to develop emerging talent. You may not have a pulse on what is available in your company. And so now that you've analyzed what's there now, don't just future plan based on some nebulous idea from outside of the company. Future plan based on the amazing talent that you've seen internally as well. If you find in the analyzing process that you have 10 more people than you knew of who have been pursuing their MBA quietly and they just didn't say anything, that has incredible potential to maybe fill some gaps in leadership. And so rather than simply going external, when you future plan, you could say, we want to retain these 10 people. So we want to try to move them to other places or perhaps put them on temporary assignments as stretch projects. You do have that as an option. So again, you just want to think outside the box. Can you reskill? Can you upskill? Can you put people on stretch assignments? Can you give people access to mentorship and sponsorship to grow their careers instead of just assuming that that person won't be a fit? Another thing to think about with future planning is to start to get a projection of which departments are going to need to be reduced. A lot of these layoffs or reductions in force have hit companies hard because it seemed like it came out of nowhere. And if we're going to be honest with ourselves, that's something that you probably should have known and planned for with your scenario planning. We have a responsibility as HR leaders, as HR executives, as business executives to have a solid view of what's happening 6, 12, 24, and 36 months in the future. We should have all types of scenarios planned for people, just like we would do for our money. So it would be considered a dereliction of duty if it crept up on us that $20 million was missing from the pot. Somebody would lose their job quickly. And so we have to have that same level of gravity toward people and culture because it is unacceptable to get to a point where you're laying off 10, 20, 40, 50, 60% of your staff overnight as if nobody knew that this could be coming. A lot of us get overly ambitious. I'm a founder, so I totally understand you get so excited, but we have to think about that. A part of thinking about our future workforce is the ratio of permanent employees to contractors, or even contingent workers, or even interns. We can change up those ratios. This is where we think about levels. So if you consider how many L3s, for example, you'll have now, well, in 2 years, those people will probably be ready. No later than 2 years, they'll be ready to go to L4. Will there be space for that? 2 years beyond that, will those L4s still be able to have a job? Are we going to backfill the L3s? Again, all of these are scenarios that you should be planning, which leads to step 3, which is you want to think about what are the current gaps. So if you know that you've analyzed the current and then you've ideated on what your future should look like, what's missing in between there? Who's missing in between there? And not just the actual workers themselves, but do they have enough managers? Do they have too many managers? Do you have appropriate representation in HR business partnership or other HR functions to support those employees? Do you have appropriate structure from a systems perspective? Give you an example. I've had clients where they outsourced so much of HR, but they were growing the company by 100 to 200%. Of course, those outsourcing tools helped when they were very, very small, but before they knew it, it was a ton of people, and they were forced to now think about, well, we got to bring somebody in house. Unless you're in a market where it is a company market and you could just quickly find a bunch of HR folks who are willing to leave their job or who might be unemployed, it's going to be difficult to pull people. And so while you're blowing up in terms of headcount, you also need to make sure that you have the appropriate staffing for all of the support, administrative, and professional services that are going to support them. You might need a couple more payroll folks on there. Maybe you need a more efficient payroll system. You might need a different benefits administrator. You might need a different benefits package. Maybe you need more options. You have to check state laws, federal laws, etc. So again, that's all a part of that analysis too. It's not just, okay, we have 12 people, we need 20, so we got to hire 8. It's everything around that. It's the entire ecosystem that will support that role and that employee's success. So step 4. This is where you start to implement a plan. But of course, if you're going to implement a plan, you need to develop one. And as I was saying for step 3, as you develop your plan, you want to think about 3 parts. First, you want to think, what type of employee is this going to be? So will it be a permanent employee, a contractor? Is it going to be a part-time employee? What would be that person's status, and what are the pros and cons? And what are the compliance legalities related to that? Because some states, depending on where your company was founded and is legally based, and where it is recruiting employees from, are going to have a significant impact on how you can choose the type of employee. So just keep that in mind. The second thing you should be thinking about is the support system around that employee. Like I was saying, not just the employee, but how many managers do they have the appropriate representation as far as HR supports, payroll supports, etc. And then the third thing you want to think about is that role's growth plan. You should already be thinking 1 year, 3 years, 5 years ahead. People don't want to stay stagnant anymore. So if you know that this role is going to be for an L2, what would it look like for that person to go 3, 4, 5? Is there room for them to move laterally? What are the preferred versus required qualifications? What are you willing to subsidize for that person to become a top performer? Are you willing to make concessions for that person to learn as they go along? What are those concessions? What would be the pros and cons? How will you socialize that that person is learning? So, again, all of these are pieces that you have to consider as you think about that role because it's not as simple as just hiring people. Companies who take careful consideration of all four of these aspects end up retaining employees for much longer than companies who do not. If you want to be a talent mill where people just come in and out and rotate, so revolving door, you can. I don't really think it would be in your brand's best interest, but it's possible. I'm going to let you do you. I ain't saying nothing, but I don't think that that's the best choice. And I don't think that it's the best representation of who you can be as a leader. A key aspect to think about, and I challenge all of my clients when we talk about this, is what did you need when you were coming up? What could you have benefited from having when you were young in your career, when you were mid-level experience in your career? What do you need now? Because sidebar, even if you determine, I've talked to a couple of clients about this, even if you're hiring C-suite leaders, they still have to be developed. Did you know that your top level employees still have areas where they need to develop? They're still going to have areas where they're going to need to fail forward. They're still going to have areas that they are going to get a 3 out of 5 on and want to grow into a 5. What are your trigger points that you would lose confidence in them if they didn't have it? What were the trigger points that people lost confidence in you at different points in your career? What were the areas where you were afraid to try to fail forward? As you think about those things, it will help you give a pulse for what could likely be some cultural norms in your company that may dictate how other talent shows up. So I'm going to give you an example of how that would play out. Let's say you were the person who worked 80 hours a week to get it done. There was no time that you would waste or no time that you weren't willing to spend to perfect your job. If you are not careful, that cultural practice will seep throughout the organization. And you may miss emerging talent that could be better placed maybe in another part of the company or still getting their footing in their industry, in their career, because they don't have that same intense work timing as you did. So if you know that really what you needed at that point in your career was someone to say, I think it's good enough for now. Go home, get some rest, come back refreshed. If you really needed that, how can you give that and signal that to your employees? And if you do that, how might it help you to identify emerging and existing leaders and position them for the next level of their career so that you can retain talent, so that you can grow talent, so that your brand as an employer is a place where people love to work? Think about that. Okay. So we talked about the 4 steps: analyzing, imagining, assessing the gap, and then you're going to be implementing a plan. It's important to archive this stuff. That's the last thing I'll say with this. You want to archive that. Sometimes HR can be kind of bad with archival, especially if they feel like it's something that's a little bit of a sticky topic. So they'll keep it super secret squirrel. But you do want to archive the journey of workforce planning because that's a good marker of how you've evolved over time. And sometimes you need to just go back to something you did before because maybe it's not the right time. You might even consider having a special team that does workforce planning projects. So at the top of every year, maybe they get together and start to assess the current talent. Maybe you have a couple people who do the future planning and then they all come together and develop the plan and assess gaps. That actually might be a great way to build confidence. And it could be a great way to boost inclusion. So if you find that the manager population and executive leader population is pretty homogenous, bringing in those other voices can help you to see talent that you might have overlooked. So keep that in mind. You can crowdsource expertise and perspectives for this. But whatever you do, please, again, make sure you archive that so you can keep track of your journey. What do you think about workforce planning? Have you ever done a workforce planning exercise before? How did it go? How did you feel? Tell me below in the comments and stay tuned for part 2, where I'm going to talk about how workforce planning shows up in every part of HR. And we're going to pull out 3 specifically. But stay tuned for part 2. Again, tell me in the comments, what's your workforce planning process look like in the past if you've done it? If not, why not? Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And of course, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.